The night they stripped me of my throne. The great hall of Vornheld smelled of candle smoke and guilt. I remember the smell more than anything else. Not the pain in my left side where the wound had gone deep, 3 weeks infected. The healers said I might not keep the arm, then said the arm would hold, but the wolf strength that came with the alpha bond might not return to its full pitch in time for the council's review. I remember thinking, in time, as though there were a clock, as though what Vornheld needed from its king could be calendared and scheduled and handed back when the paperwork cleared. The council did not see it that way. 13 men and 2 women, seated in a half-ring at the far end of the hall. Elder Voss at the center, his gray beard combed flat, his expression the careful blankness of a man who has made up his mind 3 days ago and is now performing deliberation for the benefit of the record. I stood before them with my arm in a sling, my wolf quiet inside me, not gone, not broken, simply resting in the way that deep wounds make a wolf go still, like a flame in a closed room waiting for air. I was not dying. I was not finished. But a man who has decided to take your throne does not ask for your medical opinion. Elder Voss read the decree. Incapacitation Clause, Section 4 of the Vornheld Compact. An alpha king who cannot assert wolf dominance within the reviewed period, 90 days from wound which had passed, may be considered unfit for the protection of the pack. The council, acting in the pack's interest, would appoint an interim alpha while I recovered, in whatever time recovery required. Interim, that word. I looked at the faces along that half-ring. Some could not look back. Harwick, who had hunted at my left shoulder for 6 years, found the floor suddenly fascinating. Councillor Dre fixed his gaze on the decree scroll as though reading it for the first time. Only Voss met my eyes, and his carried nothing. Not apology, not regret. Just the clean satisfaction of a chess player reaching for a piece he has wanted for a long while. I looked in those last seconds before I answered at the hall behind them. The assembled senior wolves, the Packwardens, the border captains, faces I had known since my father's time. Most of them looked at the floor, or at each other, or at nothing. A decision already made requires no audience engagement. She was at the back of the hall. I had not known Serana's name then, not well. She was the daughter of Halwyn the healer, who had attended to my wound in those first 2 weeks, and whose hands were the steadiest I had known in 30 years of injuries. Serana had assisted him, quiet, unobtrusive, always at the edge of the room, fetching what was needed, replacing what was used, speaking only when spoken to, and then saying precisely what was true and no more. The kind of presence that makes a room feel tended without you ever noticing the tending. She was standing at the back of the hall now near the door, holding a small case that told me she had come in from the healer's quarter and had not left. She should not have been there. The review session was senior wolves only, and she held no pack rank. But no one had noticed her, or no one had cared enough to send her out, and so she stood. And when the room looked away from me, she looked at me. Not with pity, that is what I remember. There was nothing in her face that wanted to comfort me or soften what was happening. She simply looked at me the way you look at something you intend to keep track of, attentive, certain, a little fierce around the eyes. As though she were making a private note, this is not the end of this man. I did not know what to do with that look. I answered the council. I said that the Vornheld Compact had its provisions and I would not stand against them. I said that I expected my wolves to be well governed in my absence, that the border posts were not to be reduced, and that I would be taking my recovery on the eastern borderland because the air was better there, and I had never liked the city in winter. I said all of this in the flattest voice I could find, because the alternative was rage, and rage in that moment would have served no one, least of all me. Then I walked out of the great hall of Vornheld, past the men who would not meet my eyes, through the doors and into the cold. I did not look back. I should have. If I had, I would have seen what I only learned 3 years later, that Serana watched me go the entire way to the door, and that when the doors closed behind me, she was still looking. The eastern borderland of Vornheld is not a comfortable place to heal. I had not chosen it for comfort. I had chosen it because it was mine, the northernmost posting of the border watch, a stone keep built on a ridge over the Varnfell Marsh, a place that had been in the Aldrich line since my grandfather. The council's decree covered the seat of power in the central keep. It said nothing specific about the eastern post. I chose to read that silence as latitude. The keep had 3 rooms and a fireplace that drew badly in a south wind, and a pack of 6 wolves who had run with me on border patrol and who, When I arrived on foot with my arm in a sling and the rest of my pride in my chest, cavity somewhere slowly dissolving, met me at the gate with the kind of quiet that wolves use when they know you need it. No howling, no ceremony. Just Bren, the eldest, gray-muzzled, 8 years old and the steadiest creature I had ever known, pressing his head against my good hand and holding it there. I sat down in the doorway of that stone keep and put my hand on Bren's head and said nothing for a long time. This was my life for the first 3 months, healing, walking the marsh in the early morning when the fog was still thick on the water, sleeping badly. Waking to the wolves piled around me on the stone floor, their warmth the most unqualified comfort available. Writing no letters. Receiving none, or rather, receiving the council's administrative dispatches, which I read and set aside and answered with the minimum required response, because engaging with the governance of a pack I no longer led was a particular kind of cruelty I would not inflict on myself. My wolf grew quieter inside me as the weeks passed, not weaker but more inward. The way a blade is when it is being retempered. The heat is doing its work, but you cannot see it from the outside. The first sign of Sorana came 6 weeks in, and I almost missed it. Bren disappeared one morning. He did this sometimes. The elder wolves have their own business, and I had never been the kind of alpha who leashed his wolves to his side. But Bren came back that afternoon smelling of dried herb and clean linen, and something underneath it that I could not name, except that it sat at the back of my jaw like the first note of a song you half know. I thought nothing of it. Bren disappeared again 4 days later, came back the same way. Then Riva, the youngest of the 6, barely 2 years old, with one ear that had never fully decided which direction to point, followed him. By the 3rd week, I was missing wolves most afternoons. I am not, it must be said, a man who follows his wolves. I give them their freedom. It is the compact between an alpha and his pack. But there is a thread between an alpha king and his bonded wolves, a quiet awareness, not control, more like knowing when a friend has left the room. And the thread between me and my afternoon-absent wolves was not pulling toward anything that felt like danger. It was pulling toward something warm. I told myself this was none of my concern. I told myself this for 2 more weeks. Then I followed them. The healer's post on the eastern borderland is not in the keep. It is a stone cottage 3/4 of a mile down the ridge, set back from the path, with a garden that, even in the tail end of autumn, showed signs of serious and organized use. Herbs in rows, the kind of order that comes from someone who actually knows what they are doing rather than someone who has read about what they are doing. A carved wooden signboard, a lantern already lit at the post, though it was still an hour before dark. My 6 wolves were all present. They were arranged around the cottage garden in the arrangement I can only describe as attended, Bren near the door, Riva at the gate, the others at intervals, not restless, not watching, simply there the way a body is when it is where it belongs. I had not seen them this settled since before the wound, if I was being honest, since before the review. The door opened. I had not seen Sorana in the great hall since the night I left, but she was recognizable immediately, the same quality of stillness, the same economy of movement, the same impression of a person who has organized their inner world very thoroughly and moves through the outer one accordingly. She was carrying a cloth bundle that proved to be a wrapped poultice for Riva's ear. The young wolf had caught a briar thorn 3 days earlier, and the sight was irritated. Sorana crouched, spoke to Riva in a voice too low for me to hear at this distance, and applied the dressing with the same steady hands I remembered from my own wound. Riva made a sound that I had not heard Riva make before. I can only describe it as contented. I stood at the top of the ridge path for a longer time than I will admit. Then I walked down. She heard me before I was halfway there, the healer's instinct, or the wolf's reaction to my approach, or simply the fact that she was the sort of person who notices things. She looked up and found me on the path without any appearance of surprise. "Alpha King," she said, then a half-second later, "I apologize, I don't know what the current form of address is." "Aldrich," I said. She accepted this without comment. She finished the dressing on Riva's ear, secured it, gave the wolf a brief pat on the ribs, and stood. "They started coming about 6 weeks ago," she said. She did not explain who they were, she did not need to. "Bren first. I wasn't sure he'd let me near him, he didn't know me. But he sat down at the gate and waited, and when I came out, he showed me the cut on his foreleg." She paused. He didn't have a cut on his foreleg. I looked at Bren. Bren was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a wolf who has never done anything he regrets. He came back with the others after that, Serana said. I've been checking them each time. They're all in good health. They seem to want to be here, so I let them come. Why, I said. It came out more abruptly than I intended. You have no obligation to my wolves. You have no appointment here. The council's healer is in the central keep. Yes, she said. She did not seem troubled by this. The council's healer is in the central keep. She said it as though it were a complete answer. After a moment, I understood that it was. I stood in her garden in the cold afternoon light and looked at her and could not find the thing I was looking for, which was, I think, some angle of expectation. Some quality of wanting something from this encounter. It was not there. She looked at me the way she had looked at me in the great hall, attentive, careful, as though keeping track. You were in the hall, I said, the night of the review. Yes. You shouldn't have been. No, she agreed. Why were you? She was quiet for a moment. Her hands settled at her sides, the stillness of a person who is deciding whether to say the true thing or the diplomatic thing. Because I thought someone should be, she said. I had no answer for that. I stayed another quarter hour, mostly watching my wolves be absurdly comfortable in someone else's garden, and then I thanked her, which felt inadequate, and walked back up the ridge to the keep. I spent that evening staring at the fire. I had forgotten, or perhaps I had never fully known, living inside it, how thoroughly alone an Alpha King is in his authority. The people who surround him are either subordinate or competing. Even the ones who are loyal to the position as much as the person. It is the nature of pack governance. The Alpha is a function, and people's relationship is with the function. To come across someone whose attention was simply on him, Aldrich, not the Alpha King of Vornheld, was something I had no established response to. I went back the next afternoon. And the one after that. 3 years is a long time. I am trying to be honest about what those 3 years were, rather than what I have been tempted, in calmer moments, to tell myself they were. They were not a simple friendship. They were not a courtship in any form I could have named while they were happening. They were something I had no word for, a daily practice of going to a stone cottage on a ridge, sitting with 6 wolves and a woman who asked nothing of me and offered nothing but her honest company, and finding that this was, improbably, exactly what I needed. Serana talked about her work the way people talk about things they love without knowing they love them, plainly, practically, with a precision that was its own kind of beauty. She knew every plant in her garden by its secondary properties as well as its primary ones. She knew her wolves, my wolves. She always called them mine. She was careful about that, in the way you know the people you spend every afternoon with, which is to say very well. She knew when Bren's hips were aching from the cold before he showed it. She knew when Riva was going to do something inadvisable approximately 40 seconds before Riva did it. What she did not talk about unless I asked, the council, the central keep, the political situation in Vornheld. Not because she was hiding it from me, but because she took her lead from me, and I did not want to talk about it, and she was not the kind of person who talked about things you didn't want to discuss just to hear herself talk. I asked one afternoon in the second winter. We were sitting outside the cottage, improbably, in coats, watching Riva attempt to catch a mouse who was clearly a veteran of these encounters. What are they saying in the keep? I asked. About me. She thought about it. That you are resting. The official word is recovering. The less official word is finished. She paused. Elder Voss does not use either word. He says only that Vornheld is stable. And what do you say? I don't say anything, she said, to them. And to yourself. She watched Riva miss the mouse by a significant margin. I say that a wound takes the time it takes, and that a man who is strong before a wound is generally strong after it, if you give him the time and don't make him perform his strength before he is ready. I looked at her. You're describing what you tell patients. Yes, she said, it applies. The wolf bond between an alpha king and his mate is not a dramatic thing when it begins. The stories say it is a bolt, a fire, a collision. My father used to say it was like a key in a lock, a rightness so sudden and so specific that the circling stops making sense. I had believed him in the abstract the way you believe things your father told you before you had occasion to test them. What I felt, sitting in the cold afternoon with Serana and the wolves and the losing mouse hunt, was not a bolt. It was the quiet recognition that I had been feeling something for a long time and had been, with some determination, calling it something else. I had been calling it gratitude, and then companionship, and then something I did not name at all. And now, sitting in the cold, I could not find any of those words anymore. What I found instead was mine. Not in the possessive way, or not only. In the way that a direction is yours, north is north, and that is your north, and the compass has always been pointing there. She was the direction my wolf had been pointing since the Great Hall. I had been walking a slow, determined circle around it for 2 years, and now the circle was closed, and there was the center of it, arguing gently with a mouse. My wolf, for the first time since the wound, stirred without a prompt from me. Not dramatically, a breath almost, a long-held stillness releasing the way a room releases when someone opens a window. I did not say any of this. I had no right to say it. I was a stripped king on a border ridge with a wound that had cost me my throne, and she was a woman who had given her time and her care freely with no indication that she wanted anything in return. I was not going to put what I felt on her like a weight. What I said was, "Thank you." For the wolves. She looked at me, and there was something in her face, not surprise, but a kind of careful, considering attention, as though she were reading something she had been expecting but was checking the reading twice. "Of course," she said. And we watched Riva finally catch the mouse and immediately lose interest in it, because the catching was the point, and we said nothing else for a long time, and it was, in the specific and unrepeatable way of a thing you will remember for the rest of your life, perfect. The summons came in the 3rd year's early spring. Not from the council, from Harwick, who had found the floor so interesting the night of the review, who had not written to me once in 3 years. The letter was short: "You should come back. Voss has moved too far. The interim is not interim anymore, and half the border captains know it." I read the letter 3 times, then I walked down the ridge to the cottage. Sorana was in the garden. She looked up when she heard me and read my face before I said anything. She had always been able to do this, and it had stopped unsettling me somewhere in the 2nd year. "Something has changed," she said. "I need to return to Vornheld." She was quiet for a moment. She set down what she was doing. She had been trimming the winter-dead growth from the herb rose and looked at me. "Your wolf," she said, "how is it?" I considered lying and decided against it, stronger than I have admitted to anyone. She nodded as though this was expected, and the arm. "Full. For more than a year." She nodded again. She did not ask why I had waited. I think she knew the answer, or some part of it, that returning to claim a throne is not only a matter of physical capacity, that there are things a man needs to settle inside himself before he can walk back into a room that stripped him. She had, in her way, been watching me settle them. "What will you do when you get there?" she asked. "Challenge the interim appointment. Invoke the provision that the recovery period does not extinguish the original title, it only suspends it. 3 years is not a term limit. The compact is clear on this." I paused. "The council will resist." "Yes," she said. "I may lose." "Yes," she said. She said it with the same evenness she said everything. Not dismissal, acknowledgement. The honest recognition that an outcome is possible and that acknowledging it does not produce it. "Sorana," I said, and then stopped. Because what I wanted to say was behind a door I had been keeping closed for a year and a half, and I did not know how to open it without what? Without frightening her, without presuming, without laying what I felt across her like an obligation. She waited. "I would like," I said carefully, "to ask you to come." Her face moved in a way I had not seen before, something careful opening. "To Vornheld," she said. "To Vornheld." In what she began, and I said, "With me, that's all I know how to say. I know I have no right to ask. I know what I am walking back into, and I am not asking you to walk into it with me in any way you don't choose. But I would like to ask." She looked at me for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I will come." It was not the bolt, not the fire. It was the lock clicking open. And behind it, the long 3 years, the afternoon light, the wolves asleep in the garden, the sound of her voice saying something true without softening it, the mouse that escaped, the morning she had been there when the whole room looked away. All of it there, all of it waiting, the door finally open. My wolf breathed. We reached the central keep of Vornheld on a morning in late spring, when the fog had not yet burned off the lower fields. and the keep walls were gray and immense against the pale sky. I had sent no letter ahead. I had told no one we were coming, not Harwick, not anyone. The only things I brought back were my arm, my wolf, my wolves, and Serana. The 6 of them moved with me up the road to the gate, Bren at my left, Riva at my right, the others behind, and Serana beside me with the same quality of quiet she had always had in the cottage garden, unhurried, attentive, as if she were simply going somewhere she had always meant to go. The gate wardens looked at me. I had considered in the weeks of planning whether there would be recognition. There was. I watched it move through the man's face, the who is this uncertainty, then the alignment of features he had filed somewhere in his memory, then the careful blankness of a man who does not yet know which way the wind is blowing and is not going to commit. Alpha King Aldrich, I said, not a question. He let us through. The great hall of Vornheld was not empty when we arrived, because I had timed our arrival for the morning governance session, which the interim Alpha Brand, Voss's chosen man, a younger son of the border house of Drev, adequate in most respects and entirely Voss's instrument in the one that mattered, conducted every 3rd morning. I had made it my business to know this. The hall stopped when I walked in. Not all at once. It was a ripple, the nearest wolves going still first, then the middle rows, then the far end where Brand sat in the governance chair that was not, by compact law, my throne, but was positioned where my throne had been. He was a large man, well-favored, with a straightforward quality to his face that I had no particular grudge against. He had done what Voss positioned him to do, and if I had been Brand, I might have done the same. He stood. The room was very quiet. Voss, seated at the right of the governance chair, was the first to speak. He had aged in 3 years, not badly, but visibly, the way men age when they have been very busy with things they consider important. His expression, as he took me in, was not the satisfied blankness I remembered from the review night. It was something more complicated, calculation under pressure. Aldrich, he said, his voice was carefully neutral. Elder Voss, I matched his tone exactly. You were not expected. No, I agreed. I am invoking Section 7 of the Vornheld Compact. The incapacitation provision suspends the title. It does not extinguish it. The term of the original appointment stands. I am returning to that appointment. A sound in the room, not quite a murmur, more a collective held breath-changing character. Brand said carefully, your wolf strength. Is present, I said. Fully. He looked at my wolves, the 6 of them, who had arranged themselves behind me and to my sides in the way that bonded pack wolves arrange themselves around a dominant alpha. Not aggressively, not displaying, simply present in the way that says this is our person. Bren at the head, gray-muzzled and calm, with the absolute authority of 8 years in his carriage. Brand looked at the wolves for a long moment. Then he looked at the room. And the room, I watched this happen, and I will not pretend it was not one of the most significant things I have seen in my life. The room was looking at Serana. I had not anticipated this. I should have. The pack sense of wolves is not directed or controlled. It is not something an alpha king commands. It is the accumulated knowing of a group of creatures who read the world through something older than language. And the wolves of Vornheld, the senior wolves, the Packwardens, the border captains, were looking at Serana with the expression wolves have when they recognize something. I had seen that expression before, on Bren at her cottage gate, on Riva when she had put her hands on the young wolf's ear, on all 6 of my wolves all the afternoons she had tended them without asking anything in return. The same recognition now across the whole room. Serana stood beside me and met the room's attention with the same quiet she brought to everything. She did not reach for me. She did not speak. She simply stood, and the wolves of Vornheld looked at her, and the room had the quality of a bell after it has been struck, the sound hanging in the air, true and clear, fading into something that is still the sound even when it is no longer audible. Voss said very quietly, "Who is this woman?" I opened my mouth. I did not answer, because Bren answered first. The old wolf, 8 years old, gray-muzzled, the steadiest creature I had known in 30 years of hunting, walked forward from where he stood behind me, walked past me, past the space between me and the governance chair to Serana, pressed his forehead to her hand, and then turned to face the room. A wolf presenting his Luna. It is not a behavior that can be performed. It is not a behavior that can be instructed. It is as specific as a lock recognizing a key. The wolf bond made visible, the pack's oldest knowing expressed in the simplest possible action. The room was absolutely still. Then Riva followed Bren, then the other four, 6 wolves forming a half-circle around Serana, facing the great hall of Vornheld, not surrounding her, presenting her, the way a pack presents the one who belongs at its center. I felt the mark. On my right wrist, the place where an Alpha King's bond mark forms when the fated mate bond completes. I had not felt it forming, which is apparently how it works. You do not feel the lock turning. You feel it when it is already turned, when the door is already open, and you look down and find that what has been there for 3 years has simply chosen this moment to make itself visible. The mark on my wrist was the shape of a running wolf, simple, the lines of it clean. Serana looked down at her own wrist. On her wrist was the same mark, the same clean lines. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at me, and her expression was, I am not sure I can describe it entirely. There was surprise in it, the honest kind. There was something that was not surprise, the long-settling satisfaction of a thing that has been approaching for years finally arriving. And there was, underneath both, the same attentive look she had given me in the Great Hall 3 years ago. This is not the end of this man. Serana, I said, because there were things that needed to be said, and this was the word they all started with. I know, she said, quietly, not cutting me off, giving me space by telling me she did not need the whole architecture before she answered. I know, yes. I could not have told you in that moment whether she meant the bond or the question I had not yet finished asking or the years of afternoon light or all of it. It did not matter. The answer was the same. I turned to the great hall of Vornheld. Brand, I will say in his favor, was a man who could read a room. He looked at my wolves and at Serana's wrist and at the expression on the faces of the senior Packwardens, who were, one by one, doing the thing that wolves do when a bond mark appears in their presence, which is to lower their eyes, not in submission but in acknowledgement, the old pack recognition that something true has happened in this room, and he made his decision. He stepped away from the governance chair. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The step was its own statement. Voss did not step away. Voss said, in the voice of a man making a final calculation, the mark could be. Elder Voss, said Harwick. We all looked at Harwick, who had not spoken since I walked in. He was standing at the edge of the senior wolf row, and his expression was the expression of a man who found the floor very interesting 3 years ago, and has been living with that ever since. Elder Voss, Harwick said again, the compact is clear. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the wolves, at Bren still facing the room from his position beside Serana, at the mark on her wrist and on mine, at the Packwardens with their lowered eyes. He sat down. He did not bow. He was not the kind of man who bowed, but he sat down and his hands folded in his lap, and the particular careful blankness I remembered from the review night was gone. What replaced it was older, simpler, the expression of a man looking at the gap between what he planned and what happened. I stood in the great hall of Vornheld with the morning light coming through the high windows and the fog still on the fields outside, and my 6 wolves and Serana beside me with the mark on her wrist. And I felt my wolf, fully, completely, without reservation or diminishment, settle into the position it had been waiting 3 years to take. Home. She was named Luna of Vornheld 3 days later. At the ceremony, the pack calls the acknowledgement, a simpler thing than a coronation, older, a circle of wolves and the alpha and his mate, and the mark visible on both wrists and nothing required but presence and truth. Serana wore the healer's gray she always wore. I had offered her the silver and blue of the Vornheld house colors, and she had looked at them thoughtfully and said, perhaps later, for now I think I should look like myself. She was right, she was always right. The wolves knew her in the gray. The gray was what had tended their ears and their hips and their midwinter coughs and their invented limps. It was not a ceremony of show. It was a ceremony of recognition, and she needed no new clothes to be recognized. The council sent their formal acknowledgments. Harwick sat in the front of the circle and looked, for the first time in 3 years, like a man who did not have something uncomfortable living behind his sternum. Elder Voss was present but quiet, which was its own kind of peace. And afterward, in the quiet of the evening, when the ceremony was done and the great hall was emptying and the candles were burning low, I found Serana at the window that looks east, toward the borderland ridge. She was looking in that direction with the expression I had come to know as her thinking expression. Contained, organized, private. "What are you thinking?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I am wondering if the cottage garden will manage without me." "I'll send someone," I said, "a good healer." "They'll need to know the secondary properties," she said. "Not everyone does." "I'll find someone who does." She turned from the window. The candlelight was on her face and the mark was on her wrist, and she looked exactly as she always had. Steady, attentive. As though she were keeping track of something important. "Aldrich," she said. "Yes." "You could have come back sooner," she said, not an accusation. The honest kind of observation that she made about everything. "I know," I said. "Was it the arm?" "No," a pause. "I didn't know at first what I was coming back to, and then when I knew, I stopped. I didn't know how to ask." She looked at me with the expression she had given me in the Great Hall 3 years ago. The one I had not been able to read at the time and now understood. I am making a note of this man. He is not finished. "You asked," she said. "That's what matters." Outside, Bren had found his way to the window ledge, improbably, for an 8-year-old wolf. He was both large and optimistic about ledges, and was pressing his nose to the glass with the focused attention of a creature who believes that the glass is the only thing between him and the warmth and will outlast it eventually. Serana turned back to the window and put her hand on the glass where Bren's nose was. The wolf's tail moved once slowly, like a conclusion being settled. I stood beside her in the candle-lit great hall of Vornheld, with the east wind quiet outside and the wolves at the gate and the mark on both our wrists. And I understood, fully, finally, in the way you understand things you have been approaching for years, that the council had taken my throne and given me 3 years on a ridge with 6 wolves, and a woman who would look at me when the whole room looked away. I am not sure in the accounting of things that the exchange was to my disadvantage. Bren's tail settled. Riva's howl sounded from the courtyard below, young and optimistic and slightly off-key. Serana smiled, which she did quietly, the way she did everything. And the long 3 years became the first chapter of something else entirely.